Okay, so you know how it is, right? You're trying to like keep up with everything going on in the world, but
Mm.
there's just so much information out there. It's really kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, I feel it too.
So today, we're tackling something that's been in the news constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Foreign information manipulation and interference, or as you'll hear it, called FEMI.
Femi. Yeah.
We're going to be looking at a recent report that breaks down like the whole architecture of these influence operations.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It is. And so our goal today is to really give you a clear picture of like what are the big trends, what are the things that are actually happening out there, and we want to do that without like, bogging you down with a bunch of jargon.
Totally, just the need to know stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's start by getting a sense of the scale of this problem. I mean, how big are we talking here?
Well, it's pretty huge. In 2024 alone, the report tracked 505 separate incidents of FEMI, and those operations utilized something like 38,000 different online channels across 25 different platforms and targeted 90 countries.
Wow, those are some serious numbers.
It's a global operation.
And which country was most targeted?
Yeah, so Ukraine was the primary target of Russian FEMI activities,
Yeah, makes sense.
with 257 incidents.
And that's probably largely focused on the war, right?
Exactly. The report suggests that Russia's FEMI efforts in Ukraine are aimed at weakening both internal resistance to the invasion and eroding Western support.
It's like an information war alongside the actual war.
Absolutely. And the report specifically mentions Germany and Poland as being key targets in this effort.
Interesting. I mean, those are some of Ukraine's biggest allies in Europe, so it makes sense that Russia would want to try to, influence public opinion there.
Yeah, absolutely. Sow some discord, create some doubt.
So beyond Ukraine, where else was Russia focusing its FEMI efforts in 2024?
Well, France was another major target with 152 cases attributed to both Russia and China, actually.
Oh, wow, both of them.
Yeah, and it seems like those activities were particularly focused around the Paris Olympics and Paralympic Games, as well as the French legislative elections.
Big events, big
Yes.
opportunities.
Right. When the world's eyes are on a certain country or event, it becomes a prime target for information manipulation.
And what about other parts of Europe?
Germany's coalition government was also targeted pretty consistently, with 73 incidents.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and those seem to cluster around major political events, international visits, even domestic issues like the farmers' protests.
So anything that could potentially cause division or instability?
Yeah, exactly. Those are the kinds of things these actors try to exploit.
Moldova was also targeted pretty heavily, I understand.
Yeah, Moldova saw 45 incidents, and the timing is interesting. It seems a lot of the targeting was related to their presidential elections and the EU accession referendum, as well as tensions in Transnistria.
So basically anything that could impact their relationship with Russia or the EU.
Exactly, and Russia in particular was pretty aggressive in its targeting of Moldova and its president, Maya Sandu. The report mentions a lot of unfounded accusations and personal attacks.
It's straight out of the playbook, right? Try to discredit your opponents, create chaos, and then try to exploit the situation to your advantage.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
That wasn't just countries that were being targeted, right?
No, you're right. Organizations were targeted in a huge number of these incidents.
Can you give us some specific numbers?
Sure. The report found that 85% of incidents, or 322 different organizations, were targeted by FEMI.
Wow, who are we talking about here? I mean, what kind of organizations?
Well, it's a pretty broad range. You've got international organizations like the EU and NATO.
Okay, those are kind of obvious targets.
Right. But then you've also got the armed forces of Western countries like Germany, France, and the US, as well as independent media outlets like Le Parisien,
Yeah.
the BBC, Der Spiegel.
Even fact-checking organizations like Bellingcat.
Yep, Bellingcat was targeted too.
So basically anyone who's trying to provide accurate information or who poses a threat to their narratives.
Absolutely. And the goal here is to erode trust.
Yes.
If people don't know who to believe, it becomes much easier to manipulate them.
It's all about sowing doubt and confusion.
Exactly.
And individuals were also targets, right?
Yes. More than half of the incidents, 53%, actually targeted specific individuals.
Wow, that's a lot. And who are these individuals?
Well, a lot of them were EU leaders, people like Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, Josep Borrell, Charles Michel.
Oh, so high-profile targets.
Yeah, and the attacks often involved really personal smear campaigns or attempts to discredit them in connection with their country's policies.
It's pretty nasty stuff. And it seems like democratic processes themselves were a major target.
Absolutely. The electoral process in particular was a prime focus for FEMI.
Yeah, and the report specifically mentions the 2024 European elections, the Taiwanese and U.S. presidential elections, the Moldovan elections, the Georgian parliamentary elections, and the French legislative elections.
So basically, elections everywhere were under attack.
Seems like it. And these operations would often escalate in the lead up to voting day and even continue afterwards in an attempt to delegitimize the results.
Right. So doubt about the legitimacy of the process itself.
So we've got a pretty clear picture of the scale and the targets of FEME. Now let's dig into the tactics, like how are these actors actually carrying out these operations?
Good question.
What are they doing?
Well, the report suggests that while a lot of FEME still relies on relatively simple tactics like text-based posts, manipulated images, or edited videos, we're also seeing more complex combinations being used.
Okay, so like multi-pronged approaches.
Exactly. And one key element that cuts across a lot of these operations is content localization.
Content localization meaning like tailoring the message to specific audiences.
Exactly. You need to make the message resonate with people if you want it to have an impact.
Right, make it relatable.
So the report found that at least 349 incidents involved content localization techniques, things like using local cultural references, highlighting events that are relevant to the target audience, and of course, using the local language.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you want to influence people, you got to speak their language.
Right. And they're even using online advertising to target very specific groups and infiltrate online communities. The report identified 28 incidents where this tactic was used.
It's getting pretty sophisticated.
It is, and another tactic that's really common is impersonation.
Impersonation, like pretending to be someone you're not.
Exactly.
How does that work in the context of FEME?
Well, it takes a few different forms. One is creating fake news websites that are designed to look like legitimate media outlets.
Oh, wow. So you might think you're reading a real news article, but it's actually completely fabricated.
Exactly. The report found 124 instances of these fake news websites.
And they're also impersonating existing entities like well-known news organizations or institutions that happened 127 times.
Yeah, it's all about leveraging that perceived legitimacy, right?
Right. Make people think they're getting information from a trusted source.
But of course, the goal is to erode trust in those sources once the deception is revealed.
It's pretty insidious.
And they're even impersonating political figures and celebrities.
Really?
Yeah. The report documented 13 cases where they either spread false information attributed to these individuals or used their popularity to amplify their message.
So basically, using their platform to spread their propaganda.
Exactly.
And what about the role of AI? I mean, we hear a lot about that these days.
Yeah, AI is becoming a big factor in FEME. The report documented around 41 cases where it was used in 2024.
How are they using AI?
Well, one way is to create deepfakes.
Deepfakes being those videos where it looks like someone is saying or doing something they never actually did.
Right. And AI is also being used to automate the spread of disinformation through networks of bots.
Bots meaning like fake social media accounts.
Exactly.
So basically using AI to create and spread fake content on a massive scale.
Yeah, and the report suggests that AI-generated text is probably being used more widely, but it's still really hard to detect.
So it's kind of like a hidden weapon.
Yeah, we don't even know the full extent of it yet.
Okay, so we've covered the tactics now. Let's shift our focus to the actors. The report really zooms in on Russia and China. So let's start with Russia. What are some of the key things that define them as a FEME threat actor?
Well, one thing that stands out is their focus on creating what the report calls a false facade.
A false facade.
Yeah, it's basically about concealing their operations by making them look like something they're not.
Like a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of thing?
Exactly, and this tactic was really evident during the 2024 European elections.
What were they doing specifically?
Well, they were trying to undermine support for Ukraine, smear European political leaders, incite protests, discourage voter turnout, all sorts of things to create chaos and disrupt the democratic process.
And were they successful?
The report notes that a lot of these attempts were actually recognized and countered through public awareness campaigns, and organizations like EUV's Disinfo played a big role in exposing these operations.
So people are getting better at recognizing and calling out these tactics.
Yeah, I think awareness is definitely growing.
And beyond the EU elections, Russia was also focusing on Georgia, right?
That's right. The parliamentary elections and the civic unrest that followed were definitely targets for Russian FEME.
What were they trying to achieve there?
Well, it seems like their goal was to exacerbate existing societal divisions and undermine the country's stability. Basically the same playbook they use everywhere else.
So discord, exploit weaknesses.
Exactly.
And the report also talks about the level of state support behind Russia's FEME activities.
It's substantial. They've been systematically silencing independent media within Russia while pouring huge amounts of money into state-controlled outlets.
How much are we talking?
The report mentions that they're planning to allocate something like 1.18 billion euros to these outlets in 2025.
Wow, that's a lot of money. It
Mm,
really shows how important controlling the information space is to them.
absolutely. They see it as a key part of their overall strategy.
And it's not just a domestic thing. Their reach is global.
Oh, yeah. Their state-controlled media ecosystems like RT and Sputnik have a huge global footprint.
And they're constantly expanding, right?
Right. In 2024, RT launched RT Balkans out of Serbia with a clear agenda to undermine EU policies in the region, and Sputnik opened a new office in Indonesia.
So they're really trying to get their message out to as many people as possible.
Exactly. And their diplomatic efforts are also closely tied to their FEMI activities.
How so?
Well, Russian officials use international platforms to try to legitimize their disinformation narratives, and their diplomatic social media accounts act as amplifiers, particularly in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America.
Interesting. So they're using every tool at their disposal.
And they've even set up these fake fact-checking initiatives like the so-called Global Fact-Checking Network.
Oh, wow. So they're trying to control the fact-checking process itself.
Exactly. It's all about controlling the narrative.
So what are some of the key narratives that Russia is pushing?
Well, there are a few that come up again and again. One is undermining support for Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia.
Okay, that's not surprising.
Right. Then there's stirring up nationalist and anti-immigrant sentiments within target countries, exaggerating economic and political divisions, fueling cultural tensions around issues like LGBTQ+ rights, and even trying to cast doubt on Western defense systems.
So basically anything that can create division or weaken their opponents?
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty comprehensive approach.
Okay, so that's Russia. Now let's talk about China. How do their FEMI activities compare?
Well, China has been using various FEMI tactics for a while now, and in 2024, their main focus seemed to be on the Taiwanese and U.S. presidential elections.
Okay, so interfering in elections is a common theme.
Yeah, and the South China Sea also remains a constant focus for their FEMI activities.
They're really trying to assert their dominance in that region,
Absolutely.
and their state-controlled media is expanding globally.
Yes, they're increasing their presence on social media platforms and focusing a lot on producing localized content, particularly in Africa.
Why Africa?
Well, Africa is a key strategic region for China, both economically and politically, and they're using their media influence to advance their interests there.
So soft power projection.
Exactly.
And it's not just traditional media they're using, right?
No, they're increasingly relying on private PR companies and online influencers to create and spread content that aligns with their interests.
So kind of like a hidden network of influence?
Exactly, and it can be really hard to trace this content back to its source. They're very good at obscuring their involvement.
Then are also increasing their cooperation with foreign entities.
That's right. They're co-producing content with foreign media outlets and partnering with local influencers to make their message seem more credible and less like propaganda.
So it's all about blending in and making their influence seem more organic.
Exactly.
But one thing that's particularly concerning about China is their focus on information suppression.
Yeah, this is a big part of their strategy, and it often gets overlooked.
What do you mean by information suppression?
Well, it's basically about silencing dissenting voices and controlling the flow of information.
Like censorship.
Yeah, it can take many forms. They use economic pressure, visa restrictions, online harassment, physical intimidation, even detention in some cases.
And who are they targeting with this?
It's a pretty broad range. They target businesses, academics, foreign governments, and individuals within the Chinese diaspora.
So anyone who speaks out against them or challenges their narrative?
Exactly.
And this suppression is often done covertly, right?
Yeah, it can be really hard to track because it's not always out in the open.
So it's a very insidious form of control.
It is.
And the report also emphasizes how China's FEMI efforts are linked to broader hybrid threats.
Right. So hybrid threats basically means that FEMI is often used in conjunction with other forms of pressure like cyber attacks, economic coercion, or even military intimidation.
So it's all part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. And this is particularly evident in Africa, where China's expanding media presence and economic influence give them a lot of leverage.
So they're using their economic power to shape the information environment.
Yeah, and the narratives they're pushing often portray the West as neo-colonial, while positioning China as a more benevolent partner.
So kind of playing on existing resentments
Yeah.
and historical grievances.
Exactly.
And what about their narratives on the global stage?
Well, a big focus for China is defending their international image, particularly around issues like human rights, their actions in the South China Sea, and regions like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan.
So basically anything that could damage their reputation.
Exactly. And they also try to leverage international conflicts to portray themselves in a positive light and criticize the West.
So, for example, the war in Ukraine.
Exactly. They'll often use situations like that to push their own agenda and present themselves as a responsible global actor.
And it seems like there's some overlap between their narratives and Russia's.
Yeah, there's definitely some alignment there, particularly when it comes to blaming the West for global problems.
The shared interest in undermining the West, even if they're not necessarily coordinating their efforts.
Right. It seems to be more opportunistic than strategic.
But still a cause for concern.
Absolutely.
So what does the report say about the future of China's FIMI activities?
Well, it projects that they're going to continue to expand their reach and develop new and more sophisticated tactics.
So we can expect things to get even more complex and challenging.
Yeah, it's a constantly evolving threat.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one more key element we need to discuss. The report introduces something called the FIMI exposure matrix.
The Fermi exposure matrix.
Yeah, it's basically a tool for understanding and analyzing the structure of these influence operations.
How does it work?
Well, it starts by recognizing that FIMI operations have a kind of architecture, a way of organizing themselves.
Okay.
And they break this architecture down into four main categories. You've got state official channels, which are the official communication channels of government entities.
Okay, that's pretty straightforward.
Then you've got state-controlled outlets, which are media organizations that are owned and funded by the government, but operate ostensibly independently.
Right, so they're not openly acknowledged as state propaganda, but they're controlled by the state.
Exactly. Then you've got state-linked channels, which are not openly attributed to the state, but can be formally linked through various forms of evidence.
So there's a connection, but it's not as obvious.
Hi. And finally, the largest category is state-aligned channels. These are not directly attributable to a specific state actor, but they consistently amplify FIMI content and narratives.
So they're basically useful idiots for the state.
Well, not necessarily idiots. They might be witting or unwitting participants, but the point is they're serving the state's interest, whether they realize it or not.
And the report uses the analogy of an iceberg to describe this, right?
Exactly. The state official and state-controlled channels are the tip of the iceberg, the visible part. But the state-linked and state-aligned channels are the much larger hidden mass beneath the surface.
So it's the hidden part that's really the most dangerous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's harder to detect and counter.
So how do they actually categorize these channels? Like, what kind of evidence are they looking for?
It's a combination of technical and behavioral evidence. They look at things like declared affiliations, financial records, shared infrastructure patterns of interaction, coordinated messaging, and the use of manipulated media.
And the level of evidence needed to categorize a channel probably varies, right?
Definitely for state official and state-controlled channels, it's usually pretty straightforward. You can find public declarations of affiliation or financial records that show the connection to the state.
Okay.
But for state-linked channels, you often need more sophisticated evidence like proprietary data or intelligence that reveals hidden connections.
And for state-aligned channels, it's even harder.
Right, because there's no direct proof of state control. It's more about showing a consistent pattern of alignment with state-attributed channels and narratives.
So you're looking for those subtle but persistent connections.
Exactly.
And this FIMI exposure matrix is not just an academic exercise, right? It has real practical implications.
Absolutely. It helps us to monitor these activities, collect better data, and develop more targeted responses.
So it's a tool for fighting back.
Exactly.
And the report also delves into network analysis of these operations. What did they find there?
Well, they analyzed those 505 incidents and found a massive network of around 38,000 channels.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is so, to make it more manageable, they focused on a core group of 2,055 channels. These are the ones that were most active and interconnected.
And they created a visual representation of this network, right?
Yeah, they made a network graph where each channel is represented by a node, and the connections between them show shared involvement in FIMI incidents.
So you can see how they all link together.
Exactly, and the size of each node indicates how active and influential that channel is.
And they color-coded the nodes, right?
Yeah, red for Russia, blue for China, and gray for non-attributed channels.
So what did this analysis reveal about the role of Russia and China?
Well, it confirmed that they're both major players in the FIMI landscape. Russia's attributed infrastructure made up about 20% of this core network, while China's was around 3.5%.
But the majority of the network was non-attributed, right?
Exactly. A whopping 76.5% was made up of state-aligned channels that couldn't be directly linked to either Russia or China.
That's a pretty significant finding.
It is. It shows that the hidden part of the iceberg is even bigger than we thought.
And the analysis also reviewed some differences in how Russia and China approach FEMI.
Right. China's approach seems to be more centralized and coordinated. Their channels often activated at the same time and push very similar narratives.
So like a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. While Russia's strategy is more decentralized and regionally adapted, with multiple parallel campaigns running at the same
They're
time.
more flexible and adaptable.
Exactly.
Can you give us some examples of the specific infrastructure they identified for each actor?
Sure, for Russia, the core infrastructure includes their state-controlled media outlets like Sputnik RT and TS, as well as their diplomatic social media accounts. But it also includes more covert entities like the Doppelganger Campaign and the African Initiative.
Okay, and for China?
For China, the core consists of state-controlled media like CGTN Global Times and Xinhua, but they also rely heavily on private PR firms and online influencers operating through networks like VN Network, Hanergy, and Paperwall.
So a mix of overt and covert operations.
Exactly.
And the report talks about these things called high-influence hubs and booster nodes. What are those?
High-influence hubs are basically the main state-controlled media outlets that act as the source of a lot of the content that spreads through the network. And booster nodes are specific channels that play a key role in amplifying that content.
So they're like the amplifiers that make the message go viral.
Exactly.
And this is all happening across multiple online platforms, right?
Yeah, they're using all the major social media platforms as well as some newer ones like Bluesky. But they do seem to have some preferences. Russia is more active on platforms like vContact, which is popular in Russia and Eastern Europe, while China favors platforms like Quora.
And they're also using this technique called information laundering.
Right, information laundering is basically about disguising the origin of the content, so it's harder to trace back to the source.
How does that work?
Well, it can involve multiple steps. The content might originate from a state-controlled outlet, then be repackaged, translated, and spread through various non-attributed channels. Or it might start in a more obscure corner of the internet and gradually make its way up to more legitimate-looking sources, giving it a false sense of credibility.
So this is a shell game.
Exactly.
And the analysis also revealed some interesting patterns of interaction within the network.
Yeah, one thing they noticed was reciprocal amplification between Russia and China. Their state-controlled media outlets often promote each other's content, particularly when it comes to anti-Western narratives.
So they're echoing each other's propaganda.
Exactly. And within the non-attributed clusters, they saw a lot of coordinated activation, content recycling, and audience segmentation.
So they're tailoring their message to different groups and repeating it until it sticks.
Exactly.
And one thing that was interesting was that state official and state-controlled sources rarely interact directly with the impersonated content used in operations like false facade.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to maintain a distance so they can deny any involvement.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly.
So the report then goes on to look at some specific covert operations. Can you tell us about Doppelganger?
Sure, Doppelganger is a Russian-attributed operation that's been active since mid-2022. It's a big network of fake websites and social media accounts that impersonate Western news outlets and government websites.
So they're creating these fake sources of information.
Exactly. And they're constantly adapting to takedowns. They just re-register domains and create new accounts.
So they're very resilient.
Yeah, it's hard to shut them down.
And what about false facade?
False facade, also known as Storm 1516 or Copy Cop, is another Russia-linked operation that emerged in late 2023. They create fake websites that look like legitimate Western media outlets, and they use bulletproof hosting, which makes it harder to take them down.
Bulletproof hosting.
Yeah, it basically means they're hosted by providers who are willing to ignore legal takedown requests.
So they're operating in a kind of legal gray area.
Exactly. And they also use online influencers to amplify their content.
So they're leveraging the power of social media
Exactly.
and portal combat?
Portal Combat, also known as the Pravda Network, is a bit different. They have a huge network of fake media outlets in over 30 languages, and they primarily focus on republishing existing Russian FIME content.
So they're like a content aggregator for propaganda.
Exactly, and their goal is to flood local information spaces with pro-Kremlin narratives.
So saturation is the strategy.
Exactly.
And finally, the African Initiative.
The African Initiative is a Russia-linked operation that specifically targets African countries. They've been sanctioned by the EU, and they're basically trying to fill the void left by the Wagner Group's activities in the region.
So they're trying to gain influence in Africa.
Exactly. And they're doing it by partnering with local media outlets, spreading disinformation, and exploiting existing social and cultural issues.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Exactly.
And the report provides some specific examples of how these operations play out in different regions. Let's start with Moldova.
Okay, in Moldova, Russia's FEMI activities have become more overt and aggressive. They're using both official and covert channels, and they've even repurposed some of their infrastructure from Ukraine to target Moldova.
So they're adapting their tactics to the new environment.
Exactly, and they're focusing on narratives that undermine the government and the EU, and they're using more sophisticated techniques like AI-generated content and fabricated documents.
So they're upping their game.
Yeah, it's a serious escalation.
And what about Africa?
Well, in Africa, Russia is really trying to expand its media footprint, and they're using a mix of overt and covert tactics. They're partnering with local media outlets, spreading disinformation, and exploiting existing tensions.
And they're really pushing this narrative of Russia as a reliable partner and the West as a neocolonial power.
Exactly. They're trying to tap into historical grievances and present themselves as a better alternative.
So a classic case of divide and conquer.
Exactly.
And the report also looks at China's use of influence for hire operations. What's that all about?
Well, it's basically about China hiring private PR companies and intermediaries to create and spread pro-China content globally. They're using fake websites, fake social media accounts, and even online influencers to push their narratives, and they're very good at obscuring their involvement.
So it's a way of outsourcing their propaganda efforts.
Exactly, and it makes it much harder to track and counter because it's not coming directly from the Chinese state.
So it's a very subtle and insidious form of influence.
Absolutely.
So to sum up, this report really paints a pretty alarming picture of the FEMI threat.
It does. It shows that this is a complex and constantly evolving challenge, and that we need to be much more aware of the tactics being used and the actors involved.
And the FEMI exposure matrix is a valuable tool for understanding and countering these threats.
Absolutely. It helps us to see the bigger picture and to develop more effective responses.
So what's the main takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing is to be aware that FEMI is happening all around us. It's in our news feeds, it's in our social media, it's in our conversations, and we need to be critical thinkers. We need to question the information we're consuming, and we need to be aware of the potential for manipulation.
Absolutely. We can't just passively absorb information anymore. We need to be active participants in the information landscape.
Right, and if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend checking out the full report. It's a real eye-opener.
I agree. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the information war that's being waged around us.
So stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep thinking critically. That's the best way to protect ourselves from these threats. Okay, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of FEMI. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.